What's up everyone, Nader here. In this video, we're going to go over attributes and their respective properties for different elements in the DOM. This is actually quite a tricky topic. I think a lot of us have probably seen HTML attributes before, things like ID and class and type and all that kind of fun stuff. It's probably pretty ingrained in how we write HTML. What's really awesome is we can actually get access to these things inside JavaScript, in this case, through the DOM API of the browser. So we can get access to all of these different aspects of different types of elements in different ways depending on the type of elements. And we can actually read from them, but also write to them, which is super, super awesome. In this video, we're going to go over all of that, plus also see how we can actually look at an idea called custom attributes using the dataset property. So without further ado, let's get right to it together. Okay, so to start, I would just like to kind of start with some kind of overarching concepts and definitions. There are these two central ideas when it comes to attributes in the DOM. There is this idea of global attributes as well as element-specific attributes. So when we're talking about global attributes, I'm going to pull this up actually in the documentation. I'm generally not a fan of reading through like reams and reams of documentation for this kind of stuff, but I just want to show you where to go if you're interested to actually read about this stuff and actually find out what's the difference between these. These are things like ID and class and many other things, which I'm going to show you in a second. These are things that are going to be available to every type of HTML element, regardless of the actual specific element type. So for example, regardless of whether we have an input tag or an A tag, like an anchor tag, we can give them both an ID, right? Which makes a lot of sense. Same with classes, right? Because that's how we actually style elements or grab elements by ID. However, there's also this idea of element-specific attributes. So again, if we think about things like inputs and anchor tags, an input might have something like a type or a name. But if we think about an anchor tag, it has its own set of different attributes, right? Things like an href, a hyperlink reference, or the target, right? Like you can open a new tab, for example. And this doesn't really make sense for something like an input element. And all of these classes or objects inside of the DOM API have their own specific attributes as well as their shared global attributes. So I just want to pull up Google really quick to actually really cement this before we go further with this idea of attributes together in the DOM. So up here, I'm going to search for, in Google, HTML global attributes. And once you have that open, I'm going to open up my favorite documentation, MDN by Mozilla. It says global attributes for the HTML markup language. So if I open that up, let me see if I can maybe zoom in on this as well a little bit. You can see that these are attributes common to all HTML elements. They can be used on all elements, though they might not have an effect on some elements. Okay, so if we scroll down here, we can see that there's a bunch of stuff that they're starting to list, but here's a list of all the global attributes, right? Access key, auto capitalize, a bunch of stuff you probably haven't even heard of or probably will never really use. But here's one that we probably do use, class, right? This makes sense. We've seen this probably before in HTML. We'll see an example together later as well. This is a teaser for what we're going to be seeing shortly, which is a custom attribute. If we scroll down further, you can see ID is here, right? Defines a unique identifier for this element inside the DOM. And I'll let you scroll through this. There's a whole bunch of these. It's not that long. It kind of eventually ends. It's not as long as you probably would expect, right? It kind of ends right here. So you can see I don't have to scroll too far. But these are things available to every single type of element inside the DOM. Now, if I go back to Google here and I search instead for, let's just do like HTML. Let's go with anchor tag attributes. Okay. So if I search for that, I probably could have just searched for anchor tag by itself actually. And if I open up, usually it's going to be in the top results, the MDN reference for the anchor element, again from the HTML spec, the A tag right here. We can see that this is their page. It's the HTML element and it has a whole bunch of different attributes on it. It defines like a URL or location and all sorts of different stuff like email addresses that we can actually link to. So if we scroll down a little bit, most of these pages for all these different type of HTML elements, which you can see listed here on the left-hand side, have an attributes section in the documentation. And this section is per element type. Okay, so each element has its own set of attributes, which is different from the global set of attributes. So this kind of makes sense, right? Because if we were to actually look at the kind of inheritance tree or the prototype tree for an anchor element, we would see that it actually inherits from kind of the node and the HTML element, which has all of the global attributes inside of it. So if we scroll through here, we can see that there's a download attribute. Scroll down further, here's our href, right? A whole bunch of cool stuff we can do with that one. There's some probably ones we've never heard of before, refer policy, rel, target, right? This is the about the blank thing that we can do to open a new tabs. And then you can see there's some ones that are really not used anymore and they've been deprecated, right? So a very short list relative to the amount in the global set of attributes. And some have much more, right? Like if you scroll through this, for example, and we look at, for example, the button, which I'll click on right here, and I scroll down to its attribute section, we can see that there's a whole bunch of stuff in there, like autofocus, autocomplete, different form things, since buttons usually are used in forms, and then the type, which is things like submit and just like a reset and regular button, as well as a value, right? So a lot of things change per element. That's kind of the point of this, but there are things that they share in the global attribute. So if we switch back here, let's take a look at some examples. So here I have a very simple HTML document. We're going to code this up in a second and actually use our dev tools to actually pull these out, because there's a lot of cool stuff we can do with the actual DOM methods. But let's just take a look at this to start. So here we have an HTML document. We have a head with a title in it. Then we have our body. The body has a div tag as well as an input tag inside of the div tag. In the div, we have one single attribute. Okay, this is an ID attribute and it has a value of container. This is very similar to something like objects, where we have keys and values, or maps in JavaScript, where we also have keys and values, right? It's usually the key equals the value, okay? And there are some restrictions with what we can do in this, is specifically how they work, pretty much primarily as strings, because this is all in HTML. So an input in this case, this specific input, I should say, that I've coded out here, actually has a few different type of attributes. It has the kind of regular attribute, the key value style right here, the type equals checkbox. And this one is actually an element specific attribute, right? If you remember back to when we looked at input, type, actually we haven't looked at input yet, I just realized that we looked at the A tag. But if you looked at the input documentation, you see that type is specific to the input, right? And there's many different types, like a text input and a radio input. In this case, I have a checkbox input, right? However, I also have these other types of attributes here. And the first one here, the kind of reddish one, is an event handler attribute, okay? And these are very specific written in a very specific way, in this case on click, right? Usually they have a prefix of on something. And we can kind of run code in here, JavaScript code, depending on some event being executed. Okay, we haven't got to events yet. That's going to be in a future video in the DOM series. Really, really awesome topic and very powerful, but it's just important to know that these are also kind of separate from regular attributes, just because there's a limited set of them as well, and they just work slightly differently. Finally, there's this idea of a Boolean attribute. So there's not that many of these. I think it's like in total, maybe like 20 something across like every single element in the browser. In this case, we have a checked attribute, which works with a checkbox and an input, and that will allow us to toggle the checkbox in the actual UI kind of on and off, as well as in the property of the actual object in the DOM, which we'll see shortly. Okay. So 3 different types of attributes here. We have the key value style, which is definitely the most common one. We have the kind of event handler style, which we'll sometimes use, but most of the time we're going to be using a slightly different way to actually add events, so we're not going to see it that often. And then the attribute Boolean style, which there's so few of these that we will see them once in a while, but it's much more rare. The most common one is going to be this purple one right here, which is the key value style, especially when we start adding our own custom ones as well. Okay, so I just kind of want to show you some code here. We're gonna write this out together. I promise we're gonna actually write some code, but just to check this out, just to give you kind of a bit of flavor as to how this actually works. So let's take our div, okay, and the div is right here. Okay, it has an ID of container and it's holding the input box inside of it. Now, in our browser tools, in our dev tools, or even in a script tag inside the actual HTML or as a separate file, we can use query selector, right? We've seen that before. In this case, since the div is the only div in this document, we can grab it using query selector div, and then we can ask for the dot attributes property. Now, again, we're going to code this, but what this is going to give us back is a special structure called a named node map. Now, no need to memorize that, totally kind of irrelevant. Just know that this is not actually an array. It's very similar to an array, but it's actually an array of key value pairs. Okay, and very similar, I think, in a previous set of exercises, we actually saw if we do query selector all, we don't really get back an array, but we can convert most of these things that we get in the DOM to an array using array from. In this case, we get back an ID equals container inside of our list, basically, and that's only one value because there is only one attribute in this div. If we had more attributes, they would be comma separated, just like a regular list of things. Okay, now, we can also grab a specific attribute using the get attribute method, right? So I've just put this on several lines here, but if we did like query selector div again, which is selecting that element, and we used the get attribute method and gave a name, specifically gave the key that we're searching for, very similar to how we look it up in a map in JavaScript, hint, hint, nudge, nudge, which is where this name comes from, we would actually get the value for that associated key. Right? So in this case, if we ask for the ID attribute, we would get the value for the ID for this specific element, which in this case is the string container. Okay, perfect. So let's actually just code this out because it's much more fun to actually play around with this in real time and actually see how it works. So I'm going to come back here. I'm going to in VS Code, I'm going to create a new file. I'll just call this attributes.html. And just to really make this proper, I'm going to do a doc type up here, and I'll just say HTML. Then I'm going to have my HTML tag, I'm going to have a head. In there, I'm going to put a title, and I'll just call this attributes demo. And then after the head, I'll put a body. Inside the body, I'll do a div. And inside the div, as you can see, I'll put an input box. And I'll say, let's do checkbox for this one. And I'll also put that it is checked. Okay. And what did I want to do here? In my ID, I wanted to have an ID of container. So we'll start with this example. Nothing fancy, right? We just have a very simple HTML document. It's got a couple of different elements in there: the head, the title, the body, the div, and the input. The input's just a checkbox, and it's going to start off as checked because of this Boolean attribute. And then we also have a div with an ID, and the input also has a type. So I'm going to right-click on this, reveal in Finder. Let's zoom in a little bit so you can see this, double click on it, and then I'm going to open it in my web browser. And if I super zoom in here, you can see here in the very top left, a little checkbox. Maybe what I'll do here just to switch back to my code, maybe just for fun, I'll just add an H1 here, and I'll just put like a welcome, just so it looks a little bit better. And if I reload this page, you can see that there's like a welcome as an H1 right above this, just so that it's like not smashed up in the upper left. If I open my dev tools over here, and I kind of super zoom in here as well, what we'll see is that we have our H1 right there, and we have our div, and then it has our input, and it starts off as checked, which is this property right here. Okay, so let's try a couple of these methods. So if I grab this div, I can do document.querySelector. I already have it selected, so I can use the $1, right? So I can do that. Or in this case, since I have it selected in my console or in my Elements tab, I can also do that. Either one works in Chrome and Firefox. I believe also in some other browsers for the $1. But we get our div, right? So our div has an ID of container. So now, if I take that div and I say dot attributes, right, and I press enter, this I think is a Chrome thing. Every browser kind of treats this slightly differently. I believe if I do this in Firefox, the result is slightly different. But really what we'll see here is, because I think one of these is actually like hidden. So we're actually seeing like both of them. Not entirely sure what the different browsers do all the time. And sometimes they actually update and change some of these things to make it easier for developers. But you can see that we effectively have access to the ID. I think it's also allowing us to iterate through this. That's what it's doing. So now that I look at this kind of makes sense. It's allowing us to kind of iterate through this, like I guess as an array. I'm guessing that's what the 0 is for, just because that's the only thing that really makes sense there. But if we open up the one that says ID, which is the one that we're interested in, and we kind of scroll down a little bit, we'll see that it has a node value or a regular value down here of container. Okay, so that is a list of all the attributes. But if I, instead of saying dot attributes to get that list, I can say dot get attribute, right? And I can give it the attribute that I'm interested in. So in this case, if I'm interested in the ID, you can see that I'll get back the string container. But if I try to give it something that doesn't exist, like for example, say like my-id, you'll see that I get back null because that is not in the actual attribute list. Okay, so let's take a look at one that has two attributes just so we can see the difference here. In this case, the input has both a regular key value attribute and a Boolean attribute. If I switch to the console, I can select that. I can say document.querySelector, query selector, so long to type. We'll do our input, and then I get my input there, and I can say dot attributes, and you can see we get back two things in this case. We get back the checked, and then we get back the type in this case, right? So if I say document.querySelector input dot get attribute, and I can say type, we get checkbox, and if I say checked, we get back an empty string, which in this case is also dependent on the browser. Just the presence of this as an attribute means that sometimes it's truthy, but we can also access this as a object property later, which we're actually going to see later. So the Boolean one is a little bit funky, and it's kind of like, why is it an empty string? But we'll get back to that later. The main thing is that we can actually get access to these inside the DOM API, which is super awesome. As you can imagine, if we tried to access anything off of the H1, it would give us back null because there are no attributes on that one. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. So what are all these different methods, right? Like what am I trying to show you here? Well, take a look at this, right? There's actually quite a few of these, and they're all super useful, and we're going to be using them quite a lot. So we've seen this one and this one, right? We saw how to get a list of all the attributes using dot attributes on any element node. We also saw get attribute, where we provided a single attribute key, and it will give us back either null if it doesn't exist, or it will give us back the value for that key, right? As you can imagine, there's also a set attribute. So we can set or create our own attributes that don't actually even exist yet, or we can manipulate one that does exist, right? So let me show you this one really quick. If I head back here, and I'm gonna clear my console, and I'll grab my div. Let's do query selector, and then I'll grab my div here, right? So that has an ID of container. Okay, so check this out. I can say dot set attribute, and I can say, what attribute do I want to set? Well, I want to set the ID attribute. Notice the ID attribute already exists, right? So if I give it a second argument here of the value I want to set it to, let's see what happens. I'm just going to change this from container to maybe holder, for example, right? Maybe a different name for a container. So if I execute this command, I get back just the result of this function is undefined, but check this out. If I actually go back to the Elements tab and I take a look at my div, look at that, right? The ID has actually changed to be holder, which is pretty great, right? And we did this through the actual set attribute function or method. Now we can do this for anything. So I can do set attribute of like say, let's say class, and I can set the class to be like, for example, maybe I have different class names. I could say like big and then like red or something like that, right? Separate them by spaces. And if I do that and I switch back to my Elements tab, you can see that now I have a big red class set onto that div, which is pretty awesome. We can do this for anything, right? We can actually set our own custom properties as well, which we'll get to later. But just to kind of give you a bit of a tease for that, I can do set the, for example, hello attribute, which is not actually an HTML attribute, right? It's not a custom one, or sorry, it's not a like element specific one, and it's not a global one. This is our own like custom one. Generally, we don't want to do this, but it is possible. Maybe I'll set hello to goodbye and make this ultra confusing. But if I change back here to my elements tab, what we'll see is that I have a hello equals goodbye now added as an attribute key value pair to this div element. That's right, pretty cool. There's so much power behind this, and you're probably thinking, oh, that's cool. I didn't know I could do that, right? Like we can do this through the attribute, but like what about the .id and the .class and all that kind of stuff? Well, we'll get to that in a second. So that is how we can set an attribute using these DOM methods. Now, there's a couple other ones as well. These ones are a little bit more obvious, as you can imagine. Remove attribute, right? I challenge you to guess what that one does. This is going to get rid of an attribute from the actual element. So, right, if I switch back here and I go back in here and I do document.querySelector.div and I say remove attribute, right, and I remove the ID attribute like that, right? I have to tell it which attribute I want to remove because these are one at a time. And I press enter here. If I switch back to my elements tab, we can see that that is now gone from the list of attributes for this div. Okay, so that's pretty great. Nothing too fancy with that one, just as you might expect. We can remove an attribute as well. And then there's this one, toggle attribute. This one is pretty kind of use case specific. This is mainly for Boolean attributes. We can toggle something on and off. So for example, if you think about that checkbox, which I'll show you in a second, we can technically do like a set attribute maybe, but it gets kind of confusing as to what we're setting it to because it's like, do we remove it and then do we set it and then remove it and set it, right? That's kind of what we're trying to do with a checkbox. So there's really this nice function, which is toggle attribute, meant for specifically this case, just to make it a bit easier so we don't have to kind of remove and add and all that kind of stuff for the Boolean attributes. So if I go back here and I try to grab my input element, which if you recall is this one right here, right? The checkbox. Notice that this one is checked right now, and it has a type equals checkbox, right? So if I take that element and I say toggle attribute, I was going to do set attribute, toggle attribute, and I want to toggle the checked attribute. So take a look at what happens, right? Right now it is checked and it has this checked attributes set in the actual attribute list. And it's also actually like visually checked in the actual DOM. Now I'm going to press enter here. Let's take a look at what happens to both of these. I'm going to count to 3. 1, 2, 3. I didn't press the enter key. I messed with you. I pressed the shift key. I'm going to try this again. 1, 2, 3. And there we go. Right. So now we get that it's unchecked in the DOM. And if we actually look at our input element, we can see, right, now that the checked property or attribute, I should say, is actually gone. Right? It's totally gone. It's not even just set to false or set to something else, right? Because as an attribute, it's either there or not there, which is how the Boolean properties work. Or attributes. I keep saying properties. Attributes work. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. Cool. So that is all of pretty much the attribute methods that we'll be using. Very powerful stuff, and we'll be using these both for our own custom attributes once we add our own custom elements, for example, with web components, but also with existing regular DOM elements as we're creating them when we get more power beyond things like inner HTML. Okay, so this is why I kept getting confused between properties and attributes. So check this out. This is super awesome. And this is kind of what I was hinting at before. It's like, oh, you probably have used this before in kind of some capacity, right? Where you haven't used the attribute part specifically, but you've actually used the properties in the DOM object directly. So let's take a look at what I mean. Let's say that we have this input element right here. So this is input of type of checkbox, right? And we have a checked Boolean property on this input. Right? So if we grab that input, so I say document query selector input, just like you saw me do in the Chrome browser, I can grab properties off of this object in JavaScript, right? Notice I'm not doing get attribute here, right? I'm just doing directly off of the object that I'm getting back from the DOM, right? This is the DOM object right here. And I can say grab .type. And it's going to give me checkbox. I can do .checked, and it's going to give me true. and I'm going to check disabled, for example, which is another possible property that it might have, and I'm going to get false because we didn't set it to be disabled. Right? As you can imagine, if I do set the disabled, which is another Boolean property, then if I actually grab that in the property, the object property, right? Notice I'm setting it as an attribute right here, right? This is an attribute. This is not me setting it like in JavaScript. This is me setting it in HTML on the actual tag. But if I grab the input element in JavaScript using the DOM API and check the property disabled on the input object, right, I will see that it is true, right? So there is kind of some synchronization going on here between attributes in HTML and their properties when we're grabbing them from the DOM API, and even vice versa. If we change the property, it'll change the attributes and how it visually looks in the DOM. Now, there are a lot of quirks with this. As I was kind of looking through some of the kind of caveats with this, there was just too many issues with certain types of elements all over the place, where changing it in one place sometimes kind of didn't fully change it in the other place, and vice versa. It's not really worth going through in this video, since it's like it's just usually something that's on a case by case, but just be aware that most of the time this is true, and we can get access to different properties as attributes and properties depending on which side of kind of the fence we're on or we're interested in. And if we end up in one of those edge cases where it's not true, usually we'll kind of be able to tell pretty quickly. Now, if we do the same thing here, as I mentioned, this would synchronize, right? So if I did input.toggle attribute in JavaScript using the DOM API, and I tried to toggle disabled, right, since it was enabled over here, it would actually disappear from the list of attributes. And we just saw this, right, with checked. Checked got actually disabled. So actually, let me switch back here to Chrome, and I'd like to kind of show you this. So if I do document.querySelector input, okay, notice that I get input type equals checkbox, and that's the only thing in there, and that's working as expected. Okay, now I'm going to do dot set attribute. And I'm going to say checked. Actually, I shouldn't do set attribute for checked. I should do .toggle attribute. I just realized that. Toggle attribute for checked. And if I run this, now notice it changes in the actual visual, but now also it's on the attribute, right? Which is what we saw. But if I do this, if I do document.querySelector input, and I directly check the checked property on this, notice that this is also true, right? So this is actually keeping synchronous with this attribute. And if I toggle it one more time, it's going to switch to false. And if I search for checked now, it's hidden behind my face here, but you can see that it is actually false, right? So the attribute checked and the actual the property, right? So the attribute and the properties are actually synchronizing with each other, right? And this is extremely important for us to know, because we can kind of access this in different ways. And most of the time, we're going to be probably trying to go this way because it's just easier, and usually it just kind of intuitively makes more sense that we want to grab this property knowing that it's an input element. However, we are going to be doing things like this a lot as well. And it's important to know that it keeps things synchronous. Imagine if we did this, but then this remained like false or true or whatever, right? And it was in the wrong state. That would become very confusing, and it would actually lead to a lot of bugs in our code. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. Now, I want to show you one last thing in this video to kind of wrap it up, and this is going to become extremely central and important once we get to things like web components in the future. So let's say that we want to create our own custom attributes, right? We've seen up until now that we have things like ID and class, right? And those are the global attributes. Those are available to all HTML elements. And I just showed you for things like an input, right? We have things like checked, for example, for a checkbox input. We have the type, right? Like text or checkbox for an input, an href for an a tag. But what if we wanted to add our own custom one, right? Like imagine we wanted to add a hello property. Could we do that, right? And you saw that we can, right? The browser is not going to yell at us for adding our own custom property. So check this out. Let's say that we have our input over here, and we can grab it in the actual DOM. And as you would imagine, if we do these here, we would get the expected outputs based on the properties. Now, if we change the input tag and now add our own property, right? Or attribute, I should say attribute. I keep mixing these up. We add our own attribute in the HTML, right? In this case, hello equals the string moo, right? This hello attribute is not an HTML attribute, right? This does not exist in the spec. It's not part of the input element either. This makes no sense to HTML or to the DOM or JavaScript, right? But we can put it in there. It's not going to yell at us, right? If we do get attribute hello, right, which is the name of this attribute, we will actually get our string moo, right? But check this out. If we try to grab the property hello off of the input object, it's going to be undefined. Okay, let me show you what I mean. So if I go back to not sources over there, I'm going to go back to my elements tab, and we see that our div has a hello equals goodbye. So I'm going to clear my console here, and I'm going to do document.querySelector, and I'm going to change this to a div. Okay, so we can see that class of big red and hello equals goodbye. So this is our kind of custom attribute that we've added here, right? So I can do that, and I can do .get attribute. I cannot get animation, get attribute of hello, right? And I will get goodbye. Okay. Now the question is, what happens if I try to grab this as a property off of this object, right? So notice this is the object, and then I can do things like I can do .class list or class name, for example, and I will get big red, right? So we'll see this once we get to styling and how that works with the actual DOM. But if I try to do ID in this case, we get nothing because we removed the ID, but this would populate correctly if there was an ID on there. But if I do .hello, look at that, we get undefined, right? So this is kind of curious, right? Why would this be? I'd like you to think for a moment as to why this might be. All right, so the answer is that for custom properties like this, right, it would be very dangerous if these showed up in the actual object, because let's take a look at this. So if I clear my console here and I just grab the div and I actually console.dir of this right here, I'll just copy that. And I open up this object, you can see that there's so many properties in here, right? Imagine if we accidentally overwrote this with our own custom property. That would be terrible, right? These are all defined globally in the DOM API, and they mean specific things, and the browser relies on them to do specific things. So we cannot define our own custom properties that are going to appear on the property side synced from the attribute side. Okay, so we can't expect to say .hello, but we can grab it as an attribute using get attribute, but we can't access it as a property on the DOM object itself because there's already all these properties in here, and the risk of a clash and many other things would be an issue. So the question is there a way to actually have this kind of show up as a property nicely without us always having to do get attribute, right? And the answer is yes, there is a way. So let's take a look at that. The way is called a data set or custom data attribute. So this is how we do it right here on the bottom of my screen. The only change I have here is I've prefixed the key hello with a data dash. Okay, so instead of just hello equals moo, I have data dash hello equals moo. Now check this out. We can still grab data hello in this case, which is the name of the attribute. We'll get we'll get moo. If I do input.hello, we're going to get undefined, right? Which makes sense because it's not there. We literally don't have this. If I try to do some funky thing where I try to do like, oh, maybe it's going to camel case it for me, which is true for things like styling, it's also going to be undefined, right? We're going to have input.dataHello would be undefined in this case. But check this out. This is the main difference. For attributes that start with the data dash prefix, right? So data dash and then anything. We have a custom property that exists on every DOM node called the dataset. And inside of that dataset is what's called a DOM string map, which is basically a fancy map, right? That has all of our properties in there listed without the data part on it. So in this case, since it's data dash hello, the property is hello and the value is moo. And if we look in the data set, right, we can see that this map is mapping hello to moo, and we can grab it just like we would from a regular object using the dot and then the key in this case. So if I said dataset.hello, I would get the value, which is moo. So let's check this out. So if I come back to my Chrome, and I'll do this all through my developer tools, just so you can see that we can actually use these both ways. And I say document.query selector the div, and I'll say .set attribute, right? And I'll set the data dash, let's go with the monkey property, right? Just to keep it different. And I want to set the monkey property to bananas, okay? I would do it like this. So notice it's data dash and then the name of the key. Okay. So if I press enter here and I go back to my div in the actual elements tab, notice I have this new attribute right here, data dash monkey equals bananas, right? Now, if I come back to my console, let me just clear this out and I do document query selector div, we can see that it is indeed there. And if I do document.query selector div.get attribute, I always do get animation. I think there we go. Get attribute data dash monkey, right? I indeed get bananas. But what's much cooler, right, is I can do document.query selector div.dataset. And notice in here, I have a map of my key value pairs. In this case, monkeys being mapped to bananas. So I can do .dataset.monkey, and I will actually get bananas, right? Isn't that totally awesome, right? Now, we can set as many of these as we want, right? So let me clear my console here. I'll do document.query selector div, and I'll do maybe set attribute, and I'll say .data dash cat, and I'll say, I don't know, maybe like some yarn here, right? And I'll press enter here. And if I look at my div here, what we'll see is that it has a data dash cat property on it, which is yarn, data dash monkey property, which is bananas. And if I look at the data set now, we can see that both are in there, right? And I can grab .cat now as well, and that'll be yarn, right? And this is going to just keep extending. And this is a way for us to securely store in a DOM compliant way without risking kind of clashing with other names inside of that list or future names that might get added to the DOM in the future for different nodes. We can be guaranteed that any custom names we have inside of here are not going to be clashing and are totally within our control. And we can kind of put stash data inside here if we need it and pull data out if we need it as well. All right. I hope you found this video interesting and valuable. If you did, I'd love it if you could like the video and subscribe to the channel. What we'll do in the next video together, as usual, is go through a bunch of exercises with this concept. We'll do things like a warm-up and a bunch of like 1, 2, and 3 exercises to get practice with actually grabbing things that are attributes out of the DOM, putting them back in the DOM, toggling them, deleting them, adding new ones, creating them, updating, all that kind of stuff, as well as the custom attributes that we just looked at, just so that we can get more practice so that when we actually end up implementing these, it becomes much easier to understand what's actually happening with these different element nodes. I'm super excited to get those exercises. I'll see you in those ones. See you later.